if you need to sweat in order to lose fat and look more lean and athletic, you're already in a trap. And that is a trap that shows very promising short-term effects, as most of the men that I work with have multiple experiences with in the past, but mostly has long-term negative consequences, as we will see in this video. So I'm going to break down why sweating, or the equivalent of sweating, is one of the most suboptimal strategies of losing fat. And I'm going to show you how you can swap it for a strategy that makes fat loss imminent over a larger period of time that feels sustainable and effortless to execute on. Now, who am I? I'm Tim, and if you're new to the channel, I help men who are fed up with having physical issues they develop by traditional forms of fitness and health, so they can build an actual athletic, lean and pain-free body in just 1.5 hours a week by using extremely precise signaling over two fundamental physical capacities that are very vital to how we move. And we accompany it with the necessary and fundamental building blocks for the healing and recovery to take place, so that we can also enjoy this athletic body, not for just a brief moment in time, but for the decades to come. Now, here is what most men believe, that in order to achieve their ideal body composition or this athletic physique and achieve a level of fat loss, they need to burn more calories versus the amount of calories that comes in, right? And their equivalent, or the equivalent in line of thinking for them, is that sweating is the recipe to do this, at least for the men that come into the protocol, where the calories out is the lever. That is what their assumption is. If I just sweat on a regular basis through exercise-induced activity, I create this calorie deficit and therefore achieve my body composition. Now, the uncomfortable truth here is that 45-minute or 60-minute or maybe even longer minute sweat is just a fraction of your daily burn, of your daily energy expenditure. And as you can see here, there are just other factors that comprise that total daily energy expenditure, which could potentially have a much larger effect in how much energy you're actually burning. So this idea that you just have to sweat is already hinting towards something of a leak in your system, or a leak in your operating system with a certain design flaw that you could mitigate or alter. And as we'll see in a second, is that this perspective has long-term consequences as well. Now, the second part in this premise, or in this line of thinking, is that the calories that come in always match the calories that come out, right? That is the law of thermodynamics, meaning that we cannot destroy or create energy, we can only alter it. Now, the problem with this line of thinking is that we expect that that system is always performing the same task activities in order to have the calories that come in are equaled towards the same calories that go out. Yet, we are not machines. We do this every day in a sequential order in the same precise way, just like machines do. We are bio machines, meaning we are adaptive. We are constantly interacting with our environment, which have influences on so many elements of our biology and physiology, right? So inflammation could be a little bit more because you have a poor night of sleep. Your central nervous system is shifted more towards a sympathetic state. The more stressed environment has an effect on your gut. Gut could potentially have an effect on less nutrient absorption and less detoxification in the system, which can have an effect on how you're producing enzymes, and so forth and so forth. And I'm just scratching the surface here, but it basically says that our organism, our system, is extremely complex and is constantly influenced by the interactions that we have, which means that yes, calories come in a certain way, potentially comes in a certain way. However, how we function on a day-to-day can have an influence on how we are expending calories. And these two elements already create a fundamental problem, is that we put all of our eggs in a short-term strategy that is an oversimplification of what actually is going on, which has long-term potential consequences in how we actually are expending energy. And that is because your total daily energy expenditure works like this. You got your basal metabolic rate. So this is the amount of energy that you're expending in rest. So think of if you would sleep all day, your organs, your tissues, your brain and nervous system, and other elements, they still require energy. So the amount of energy you're expending there, that is your basal metabolic rate. Then you've got energy that is being converted from the production of food, or the conversion basically of food, of substrate. So what you eat, that undergoes changes, that sort of produces heat, and that is also where a level of energy expenditure comes from. Then another layer, an even bigger layer than exercising, is your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So think like sitting, think walking, think going to the grocery store, think fidgeting. So all of these very low intensity activities, physical activities that you do, that is your NEAT. Then finally you got your EAT, your exercise activity thermogenesis. And that is what we already referred to. That is the thing that most men think they need to manipulate most in order to lose fat, achieve their body composition, right? But what they miss in this line of thought is that yes, you are burning more calories, or you are burning more calories, but what you are also doing is, through that burning of energy, you are also burning through nutrients that need to be replenished, right? Because if you don't, you're not supplying the body with enough nutrients, or potential, I can say them like assisters, in order to help with the conversion of substrates, foods, into potential energy. So what people neglect in this element is that they are burning more, but they, as a result of trying to maintain that calorie deficit, they are losing, or don't have a good eye on the ball of how many nutrients they should actually provide themselves more of, in order to make sure that the body still feels that it has enough resources coming in for their energy production. And if those needs that the body then has more of, or more needs for, if they are not met, this could mean that your systems, or subsystems in the body that all require nutrients, certain amount of energy, they get decreased. So for example, if you for a prolonged period of time are in a stressed state, and you're not giving the body enough nutrients, macro and micro, then potentially your body decides like, okay, we've got less resources coming in, let me shut down certain hormonal activities. So like steroid hormones, or your thyroid, they get lowered. But this has a decreased effect, or this has an effect of decreasing your basal metabolic rate. If you have less calories coming into the system, or potential calories coming in of the system, your body undergoes certain processes inside of the system to make energy available, right? Either breaking down adipose tissue, or even worse, breaking down elements of your own structure, building down own tissue. Now, these elements, over a prolonged period of time, what then tends to happen is that your basal metabolic rate, as a result of you expending more without giving the necessary nutrients, macro and micro, what then happens is your basal metabolic rate will start to lower. And as a consequential effect, what then needs to happen, you need to then train more in order to achieve the same effect. Because if you would still exercise similar like you did prior, you can see that your total daily energy expenditure gets less. So you need to burn even more, right? But as a consequence of that, if you keep doing this in a prolonged period of time, you are saying to your body, hey, we're even more in a survival state, because again, we got less nutrients coming into the system, we got less potential energy that we can utilize for all of the systems to keep them up and running and thriving. So your basal metabolic rate again starts to drop. So you can see already, because and that already creates this effect that you need to exercise more of again. So you're creating a prison for yourself, a downward spiral. And what tends to happen, and this is what I hear, like I've almost never heard, maybe you're David Goggins, and I would say that is one of the most poorest approaches to physical health in general. But maybe if you're David Goggins, but let's say you're not David Goggins. Let's say you still require, or you still for a prolonged period of time, you manage to exercise more. At one point, your system starts to break down. It doesn't want to go anymore. You're not motivated anymore. You have poor, your sleep starts to digress. Your libido is tanking. So your whole system starts to decline. And what then ends up happening is that you've not only lowered your basal metabolic rate, you have lowered your total daily energy expenditure, which means that if you then have a moment of relapse or whatever, your total daily energy expenditure is even less, meaning that you can consume or that you burn even less. And that has just negative effects in general, because again, it's so much harder then to come back out of this vicious loop, where you potentially started out with total energy expenditure of 2,300 or 2,400, and then maybe it's 2,000, but you need to then build it up again. So it's a nightmare. It's a cycle, and I know it because I was there as well. I was in this nightmare, and then every extra calorie you take immediately gets stored as fat, and the body undergoes elements because it was very long in a stressed state. So this is just a nightmare to be in. Now, if you flip it, however, if you focus on still the exercise, but you use it not to sweat, to burn off calories, but to induce a stimuli so that over time your basal metabolic rate will increase, you not only need less exercise in order to achieve a similar or maybe even a higher daily energy expenditure, you can acquire it in a much more sustainable way. So you exercise less, you focus on your basal metabolic rate, and you achieve fat loss while building the structure, because that is a much more effortless way, and doing it in a fashion so that once you acquire a level of body composition or a level of fat loss, it stays with you, right? Because it didn't cause any effort or small amounts of effort, but you focused on achieving this fat loss by not burning more calories, but by building a machine, a systematic machine that burns more from a resting element, from a natural state, right? So this is the biggest shift I want you to remember. You still want to provide an exercise, or you still want to do an exercise, but you want to do it as a way to manipulate your basal metabolic rate, so that over time, this system, that organism that you are, that is simply just expending more energy, so that you don't have to undergo these rigorous exercise-induced pathways in order to achieve it. So now you know why you want to build versus burn. Let's see how you're going to do that. First of all, we want to be much more precise with that exercise. So as I already mentioned, we don't want to burn more. We want to be very precise so that we can actually build more, so that this structure becomes larger, bigger, and your tissues, because tissues are one of the largest energy expenditures, your tissues become larger so that you're simply just burning more, right? That is increasing your basal metabolic rate. Now, rather than doing these very vicious sessions where you're sweating a lot, or doing full body strength workouts where you're basically just accumulating stress and potentially burning a lot, we want to respect this one element that drives growth. And that is this process called mechanotransduction, which is a way of saying that our cells, or the tissue cells, they work with an all or nothing approach. And we have outer layers like the extracellular matrix. Once those get triggered to a certain point, once we tensify our tissues to a certain point, that has then a cascading effect on the cell, or the cell takes notice, and it has a cascading effect where it notices, or where it feels the need to grow better, stronger, and more adaptive towards that stimuli. So rather than spending a lot of our time building up towards reaching that threshold, right? So very slowly working to maybe the final repetition of a 3 set that is actually stimulating growth. What you want to do is you want to flip the script. You want to be much more precise with knowing what this threshold means and getting closer to that faster and spending more time there. Now, I'll show you the approach that I work with in the protocol that I'm doing. However, this could in general sense mean that rather than having 4-5 sessions per week, try to spend it on maybe 2 to 3 sessions per week where you focus on your largest muscle groups, so patterns that encompass larger muscle groups, and only train for one set. Because what one set does, it automatically forces you to be in a position where you have a limited time available. So you want to be very precise. You want to be very precise in how you're stimulating your tissues to grow. Now, how I like to do that is I like to divide it over 3 modalities that comprise the 2 fundamental movement capacities in how we move. So what I see time and time again, if you focus on building full range and end range strength over your joints, and you try to stimulate as much of your brain and nervous system's capacity to coordinate different moving pieces, different moving parts of the body under load, what tends to happen is that you create a beautiful spectrum of which all movement expressions that you want to do will be expressed in the way you want to. So for strength, we got 6 patterns, and these are patterns in which you encompass all of the largest muscle groups and tissue elements around the hips, spine, and the hip, spine, and the shoulders. And you do that in the building that strength or that force production, relative force production into a central plane of motion. I have other videos where you can check out the patterns there. And also, I got a remark about this, but basically the patterns that I work with for the strength part is something I accumulated over the last 7 years that I've been working, but especially the last 1.5 years. I got also inspired by Jack Woods in his line of thinking on how to build that strength and how you can actually be much more precise with how you trigger a stimuli or provide a stimuli that triggers growth to happen. So shout out to Jack Woods. If you don't know him, I think watch him definitely, because he's, I think, an innovator when it comes towards building strength. And I think he's also inspired by some other gentlemen who been at this for decades to come. But basically the whole idea is that if you get close towards your max threshold and you stimulate it there, you basically only provide the stimulus and be maximally efficient. Now, for mobility, this means that you strengthen your end ranges in your most fragile positions, in also ranges of motion that your shoulders, your spine and hips can enter. Meaning that we don't only work the sagittal plane of motion forwards and backwards movements, but we also utilize side to side and rotational movements. So that, again, we not only have full range strength over those sagittal plane ranges, but we also have end range strength in all of the other modalities. And finally, or at least what I like to do, is I work with the spine in a way that mimics your locomotive capacity through space. So the coiling core, which is something from David Weck, which I found extremely potent because it has a very profound effect in how you are rotating and moving in locomotive fashions through space. Plus, I like to work it with, or I like to execute on it with a band, so that you also have this extreme force production element, this element, or this extreme contractile element, so that your brain and nervous system also get stimulated and you can get towards that max threshold as fast as you can. So this means that in my system, or at least the protocol that I'm running, I work 7 to 12 patterns per person per week, and they almost executed that once per week for a total of 1.5 hours a week, being very precise. So we are greatly reducing the amount of time spent on this catabolic element, on this exercise element, but we do it in a way that still stimulates growth for that basal metabolic rate to increase, and that comes in the second part. So the second part is that we want to be still very deliberate, but we also want to be very generous with the anabolic side of how we're growing tissue, how we're improving our basal metabolic rate. Now, what this doesn't mean is that we want to create a stress dominant environment. So think of eating excessive protein shakes, processed foods, processed junk, being in a very low caloric state for prolonged periods of time, doing a lot of intermittent fasting, being still awake, entering emails at 9 p.m., eating behind screens, excessive blue light exposure, all elements that are having or have you still in or have the body and your physiology still in a very stress dominant environment, right? If you eat behind your screens, you still are in a sympathetic mode of your nervous system, meaning that the rest and digest system that activates once you're in a parasympathetic mode, and all the parts that from an enzymatic perspective that come to fruition and need to come to fruition in order to absorb the substrates, foods that come into the system, will not be totally maximized. So that is just one example. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you've spent a lot of time in an optimal anabolic state, meaning that you want to prioritize animal fat and animal protein, right? The amount of nutrients that are in animal fats and protein are just unmatched. Same goes for fruits and honey. Easily digested, are digested in the small part of the intestine, which is how our physiology works best. And of course, having potentially other digestible carbs like potatoes, maybe even some white rice here and there. Also supplying yourself with raw milk if possible, or goat milk, also immensely dense in nutrients. Eating nose to tail, one of the best things you can do, organ meats, adding those in once per week. Making sleep your cornerstone, which is one of the most, it's also something I've neglected for years, and I've seen the consequences of it. But the more I make sleep I've made sleep my cornerstone, my sort of this is what I want to cover, like, then automatically you're also making your circadian rhythm a priority. You're also making limited blue light exposure a very vital component. You're also making your nutrients that come into the system, or a little bit of having a window versus when you go to bed. Like, all of these elements work together. Or eating in the sun, or trying to spend more time in daylight as much as you can, and having little to zero supplement stack because you simply don't need it. That is creating an anabolic state that is energy dominant, that is providing the body with the necessary nutrients, so that once we've stimulated growth to happen at the levels of our tissue, therefore stimulating to increase that basal metabolic rate, we make sure that we complete the loop by giving ourselves, our body, the right environment so that it can actually undergo these changes. So these two elements will make sure that you respect your biology to its fullest, have you switch from a state of survival and start being in a state of wanting to thrive, right? And as a beautiful positive consequence of it is that you don't need to rely as much, or almost as much, just almost none, on this burning in order to acquire body fat loss for a sustainable fashion. You do it through very specific stimulation and providing the necessary nutrients and the environment for the body to grow. So building the organism so it needs less exercise and you can burn more calories over time. And this is also the most sustainable way to do it. And that's also what I saw for myself, making immensely great progress by simply just increasing my calories a lot and providing it with foods that we are meant to eat and we are meant to digest very well. That has just one of the biggest changes on my physique, and also, maybe even more important, how I feel and how I are, doing my thing in the world, basically. So that is very important, and what you can already see here for the gentlemen that also have included this protocol or this line of thought is you saw a client of mine, Vincent, who lost a ton of weight and body fat by simply just being much more precise with how he induced the exercises and providing it with all of the necessary components for the regeneration to take place. Same goes for another client who lost a ton of weight, lowering the amount of training that he did, being much more precise with what he ate, without feeling restrictive, but much more in line with how his body should optimally function. Same goes for Bob, another client who lost a lot of visceral fat in just 3 months of time, and also training no more than 90 minutes a week. Or Matt, who was crazy. He got crazy diced and lean by simply eating much more fruit, lowering certain or ditching certain foods, junk foods that he maybe ate in the past, being much more deliberate there. Or another client of mine who built some serious size, and especially for his body composition was hard to do. All of these gentlemen showed that just simply lowering the amount of activity that you have to do, being very precise, creating the right environment is the way to grow a structure that is just spending more energy on autopilot and doesn't feel any need for it to need to do cardio, to need to burn more, because simply the body is very intelligent, and if you listen to it and if you respect it in the way it wants to be utilized, then you will achieve amazing results, amazing body composition changes by doing less and being more precise and aligning with your physiology. Now, if you want to know more on how that looks like into a personalized setup for you, you can check the link below, and you of course can watch other videos on the YouTube channel where I dive deeper into certain elements of the things I just listed out. This was it, and I'll check you later. Ciao.